Millennial Cowboy finds freezing nurse at train station. Their love story made history. Before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe and follow Tender Bonds. Like and share our story. The Amtrak platform at Sandusky smelled like diesel and the particular cold that comes off Lake Erie in January. The kind that doesn't move through you so much as settle in and unpack its things. Silas Cade had been standing beside the idling F-350 for 11 minutes, engine running, because the alternative was sitting in the cold, dark thinking, which he was already doing anyway, watching the 6:40 from Cleveland discharge its dozen passengers into the orange sodium light. He was not there to meet anyone he knew. He was there because Trace Hollowell had asked him to be, 8 months before, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and the particular flowers nobody should have brought, because Trace was already past smelling them. Cass's sister, Trace, had said, not even opening his eyes, "Coming in January doesn't know anybody, you know how it is." Silas had said he did. He had no idea how it would be. The woman who came through the glass doors last, always last, he would learn, always the one still helping someone with their bag, wore a down coat the color of old mustard and carried a duffel that listed hard to the left. She was not small, but she moved like someone accustomed to making herself smaller. Sideways through doorways, shoulders angled inward, the practiced economy of a person used to hospital corridors at 3 in the morning. Her face, when she turned it toward the parking lot, had that particular blankness that isn't emptiness but its opposite. Someone who has been fully present for too long and has temporarily left the building of herself. She saw the truck, she saw him, she didn't wave. He didn't either. She walked across the lot and stopped 6 feet from him, the duffel correcting her posture whether she liked it or not. "You Silas," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Don't do that." She set the duffel down. "Cass says you do that to be difficult." He looked at her. She was looking at the truck. There was ice in her hair, just at the temples where it had melted and refrozen on the platform, and she either didn't know or had decided it wasn't worth her attention. "Your sister's finishing a closing on the Marner property," he said. "She'll be another hour." "I know where Cass is." She picked the duffel back up. "Can we get in the truck?" Not a question either. He took the duffel. She let him, which surprised him, and then she said, without looking at him, "The extended stay on Cleveland Road. I looked it up." "That place has a mold problem," he said. "Second floor, north side." She stopped at the passenger door. "How do you know which room I'm in?" "I don't. I'm saying the second floor, north side has a problem. It was in the paper." He put the duffel in the bed. "You should ask before you take your coat off." She stood there a moment. He could see her deciding how much of this to engage with. "Fine," she said, and got in. He went around and got in. The cab felt different with her in it, not crowded exactly, but inhabited in a way it usually wasn't, something recalibrating in the air. He pulled out of the lot onto 250 West. The fields ran flat and dark on both sides, the road salted white, the lake invisible but present the way large bodies of water always are. A pressure in the air, a low subsonic fact. "After 4 miles," she said, "Cass told me you had a ranch." "Cattle operation, outside Huron County." "How many head?" 200, give or take." She nodded, looking out the passenger window. "She said you did well for yourself." "I do all right." He could feel her not saying something. It had a specific texture, that particular unspoken thing, and he drove another mile before she found the shape of it. "She said you had money," Joni said. "Mineral rights," she said, "West Texas." "Had them sold most." "So you have what, a lot of money?" "Some." She turned from the window and looked at his profile. "Why are you driving a truck with a cracked dashboard?" He looked at the crack in the dashboard. He had genuinely forgotten it was there. "Because it still drives," he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and turned back to the window. "Cass said you were like this," she said. Like what? She didn't answer. He drove. After another mile, he said, I'm not doing this because Trace left me money to do it, or because I think you need looking after. I know what I need, she said. I know you do. She was quiet. Then why are you doing it? He thought about that. The road ran on. Somewhere behind them the lake groaned, ice shifting, February already threatening in the bones of the weather. Because he asked me, Silas said, and because I don't have a lot of people to say yes to. She turned and looked at him again, longer this time. He kept his eyes on the road. That's an honest answer, she said. Most of mine are. She turned back to the window. Neither of them spoke again until Sandusky, where he asked her if she'd eaten and she said she'd eaten on the train and he didn't push it, and he took the turn toward the extended stay, and they went through the business of getting her checked in without further conversation. The room was on the second floor, north side. He mentioned it again at the elevator and she said, I heard you the first time, and went to the desk and changed it. That was the whole of the first night. She had been a traveling nurse for 6 years. Pittsburgh, Flagstaff, a year in Billings that she didn't elaborate on. She'd taken the position at Firelands Regional because Cass had called in September and said, I need someone here. Joe, actually here. And Joni was constitutionally incapable of hearing that sentence and doing otherwise. He learned this in pieces over weeks, the way you learn things about people you see in the practical context of a life. The Sunoco on 250, Cass's dinner table, a parking lot. The tire was the second time he saw her alone. She was on her knee in the Firelands lot at the end of a 12-hour shift, still in scrubs, pressing the valve on a tire that had no business being driven on. He had been there on other business. The vet's office shared a parking lot, and he'd pulled in and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. She looked up. I've got it. I know. He crouched anyway and looked at the tire. You've got a nail in the sidewall. It's not fixable, it's replaceable. I have a spare. You have a spare that's been on there before. He'd seen it when he'd walked past. You need a new tire. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. She was tired in the specific way that nurses get tired, not sleepy, but compressed, like something under long pressure. I can pay for my own tire, she said. I know that. Then why? She stopped, looked at the tire. You think because you have money you get to just fix things. He considered that. No, he said. I think because you've been on shift since 6 this morning and there's a discount tire 2 miles up the road and I'm not doing anything else. She looked at him for a long time. I don't want to owe you. You won't. I'll take it off the cost of me asking you a favor sometime. What favor? Haven't thought of one. Something shifted in her face, not warmth exactly, but the suspension of active resistance. Fine, she said, and stood up, and that was how he spent a Tuesday afternoon sitting in a discount tire waiting room with a nurse he barely knew, while a man named Carl mounted a Goodyear on her Civic. She bought him a coffee from the machine without asking. It was terrible, and he drank it. Trace grew up 3 miles from me, he said, because the silence had taken a specific shape and he thought maybe he should do something about it. Outside Midland, we shared a bus stop. She held her cup in both hands. Cass said you were close. Long time. He ever talk about Texas with you before? Some. He looked at the machine. His dad's property had about 40 acres of mesquite between it and mine. We spent most of our time out there, built things, stayed out of the houses. She glanced at him. Your dad drink too. He looked at her. Trace told Cass, she said, and Cass tells me things. Yeah, he said, he did. She nodded slowly. Trace used to say that mesquite was the only honest plant in Texas, ugly and it survives everything. She looked at her cup. He said you were like that. Silas looked at the garage bay where Carl was working. He said that. He meant it as a compliment. I know what he meant. Carl came in with the paperwork and Joni paid before Silas could move, which was deliberate, and he let it go because it clearly mattered to her. On the way out she said, "That favor, I'll think of one." "All right," he said. She got in her car and drove away, and he sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off, the cold settling in, and thought that Trace had known something Silas had not. He was not, in the weeks after, a man who would have described himself as pursuing anything. He was a man who brought groceries when the IGA ran a special on things she'd mentioned eating. He was a man who drove a particular route past Washington Street, not because it saved time, but because the porch light being on told him something he didn't examine. He was a man who, at Cass's dinner table, noticed which questions Joni asked and stored the answers like a man setting aside lumber he wasn't sure he'd need. What he was accumulating without articulating it was evidence. Evidence that her laugh, which was infrequent and arrived without announcement, sounded like something being unlocked. That she ate quickly, efficiently, as though meals were still logistical problems from years of shift work. That she had opinions about cattle breeding that were more informed than they had any right to be, coming from someone who'd spent 6 years in cities, until she mentioned that her grandfather had run a small operation in central Ohio, and she'd spent summers there as a girl. That she never asked him for anything, not once, but she would do things for him without naming them as such. The second cup of coffee appearing near his hand, the note left on his truck one afternoon, "Your left rear brake light is out. Thought you should know," unsigned, precise, the handwriting of someone who wrote in the margins of medical charts. He drove home from Cass's one night in late February, the temperature having cracked 30 for the first time in weeks, the roads wet and dark, and he realized somewhere on Route 250 that the house had acquired a frequency he noticed only in her absence, a particular register of quiet that was different from the quiet he had maintained for years. He'd always thought of his quiet as a possession. Now it felt more like a symptom. He didn't do anything about that. He was not a man who did things about realizations, but he stopped telling himself he wasn't paying attention. The pipe burst on a Tuesday in the second week of February, before the thaw, in the last hard cold. He got there in 18 minutes. The building's water shutoff was in the basement behind a door that needed a shoulder, and he got it shut and went upstairs to find Joni standing in her bathroom doorway in scrub pants and a thermal shirt, hair pulled up, holding a mixing bowl under the light fixture, which was still draining. A second bowl sat full in the tub, a wet towel on the floor. "Shutoff's done," he said. "Thank you," not looking at him, watching the drip slow. "Plumber in the morning," Castle called the landlord. "I know how it works." He looked at the ceiling at the spreading stain. "Who's your landlord?" She said a name. He knew the name. Knew the man owned 4 buildings on the east side and maintained none of them and had twice been before the city council about code issues. He thought about saying so and didn't, because she was already looking at the drip with the expression of someone doing arithmetic about a situation they didn't have the bandwidth for. "I can help you with the landlord," he said. She looked at him, meaning what? "Meaning I know people, the city inspector, the—" "No," she said. "Joni." I said no. She carried the full bowl to the kitchen and he heard her dump it. When she came back, "I don't want to be a project." "You're not a project. People with money fix things, that's what they do. They make problems go away and then they own you a little." She looked at the drip. "I've been owned a little, I don't like it." He stood there, the drip filled the silence. "I'm not trying to own you," he said. "I'm trying to," he stopped, because he didn't have the right word for what he was trying to do, or the right to the words he did have. She looked at him. Her face had gone to that careful neutral that he'd learned meant she was deciding something. "I'll handle the landlord myself," she said. "If I need your name, I'll ask for it." "All right. Thank you for the shutoff." "Yep." He stood there a moment longer than he needed to, and then he said, "You can come to mine tonight, 4 bedrooms. I'll have you back by 5:30. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the truck on the first night, long, like she was reading something in small print. I make my own coffee, she said. I know. She went and packed in 10 minutes the nurse's economy of motion, grab what matters, go, and in his kitchen she found the cabinet without being shown, made the coffee, poured 2 cups and took hers to the table. She looked out the window at the dark equipment barn. What's that red thing in there? She said. Trace's toolbox. She was quiet. The kitchen held the silence differently than the apartment had more space in it, or the right kind of space. He had a toolbox like that, she said. In Cass's garage when they were first married. He'd always have the drawers open and tools all over and then put everything back exactly right. She looked at her cup. Drove Cass crazy. He did everything that way, Silas said. Made a mess getting to something and then put it back clean. She looked at him. The drawers are rusted shut now, he said. The lock too. She was still looking at him. He looked at the table. I should open it, he said, sort it out. Yeah, she said, you probably should. Miller, the old Bludick, came through from the living room and went directly to Joni and put his head on her knee. She put her hand on him without looking down. Automatically, the gesture of someone long accustomed to being what a room needs. They talked about Trace until the coffee was gone. She said he wasn't wrong about some things, and she said he was infuriating about others, and Silas said yes to both. At some point she went to the guest room and he went to his, and at 5:15 his alarm went off and he drove her back in the gray pre-dawn, and when she got out she said, "Thank you, Silas," and he said, "Yep," and she went inside. He sat in the truck with the engine running. He had offered his house to a woman who didn't want to owe anyone, and she had come, and she had made the coffee and put her hand on the dog and talked about Trace like a person, talking about someone they'd lost rather than someone they were still moving around the edges of. And the morning was doing something cold and gray and slightly luminous outside the windshield. He put the truck in gear and drove home. March came in the way Ohio marches do, not warm, but a loosening, a suggestion, the frost pulling back from the edges of things, the sky lifting a foot or two. He had been to her apartment 4 times since the pipe, once with Cass for dinner, twice alone. And once in the early evening for no reason he'd named out loud, arriving with groceries that had accumulated without entirely being decided, and she'd taken them and looked at him and said, "Are you doing the thing where you do things without saying why?" And he'd said, "Probably," and she'd said, "Okay," and made him eat. The 4th time he'd knocked and she'd opened the door and looked at him and said, "You eat yet?" And he'd said, "No," and she'd held the door open and that had been that. He was not still, calling it anything. He was doing what he had always done, moving through the practical dimensions of a situation, appearing where appearing was the logical next thing. He had lived inside that logic for 44 years. It had built him a profitable operation and 4 bedrooms and the kind of independence that looks identical to loneliness from the outside and is often indistinguishable from it on the inside. What was changing, what he was beginning to look at sideways, was the quality of the not examining. He had been not examining things his whole life, and it had always felt like discipline. Now it felt like the rusted drawer on Trace's toolbox. The thing was in there. He just hadn't put the work in. The boy was Deb Sarris's kid, 8 years old. He ran a fever of 104.2 on a Thursday afternoon in late March when the thaw was real and committed, the fields sheeting water, the ditches running full, the whole county smelling of released earth. Deb called at 3:40. Her husband was in Columbus, the county road ditch was too high for her sedan, and the boy Cam was past complaining, which was the wrong kind of quiet in a child. Silas was there by 3:55. Cam was wrapped in a blanket in the back seat and barely tracked Silas loading him in. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes had that glassy recession that Silas had seen once before, in a bad year, in a man he knew, and he pulled out of Deb's drive and called Joni before he reached the county road. She picked up on the second ring. "I'm on shift." "Kid, 8 years old, 104.2. Deb Saris from up my road. I'm bringing him to Firelands. He looked in the rear view. He's not tracking right." A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. How long since the fever started? He looked at Deb. "Since this morning," Deb said. Her voice was doing something she was trying to stop. "He threw up twice. He said his neck hurt." He relayed it. "Drive faster," Joni said, and was gone. She met them at the ER entrance without a coat, the cold not apparently registering, and she looked at Cam once and said 2 words to the intake nurse, and the chair appeared, and they were through the doors, and Silas was standing outside with Deb, who had started shaking now that there was nothing left to do. He put his hand on her shoulder. He got her coffee from the machine. He called her husband and held the phone toward her when the man picked up, because she needed to hear his voice more than she needed to talk. He sat with her for 2 hours in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and the particular floral of bad air freshener, and he looked at the doors and did not think about the last time he had sat in a hospital waiting room. He did not think about it with the focused intensity of a man actively refusing to think about something. The waiting room had a television on the wall showing weather with the sound off, a front coming down from Canada. There was a man asleep across 3 chairs. Fluorescent light doing what fluorescent light does to everything, flattening, exposing, stripping the dignity from ordinary fatigue. Silas sat in it. He had the mineral rights money, and the cattle operation, and the 4-bedroom house, and a dead friend's toolbox with rusted drawers, and he was sitting in a waiting room holding a cup of bad coffee for a neighbor whose child he had driven here, because there was no one else to drive him, and something was happening in his chest that he had no prior categorization for. Not grief exactly, not the trace-shaped thing, something more structural like a load-bearing element that had been stressed for a long time finally announcing itself. His hands, when he looked at them, were not steady. He put the coffee down and pressed his palms flat on his thighs and breathed through it. At 6:15, Joni came through the doors. She went to Deb first. Her voice dropped to the register Silas had heard her use once before, at Cass's, talking about a patient. Steady, direct, nothing wasted. "He's okay. Bad flu, not meningitis. They're keeping him overnight, get the fever down, make sure he holds fluids. You can go back now." Deb made a sound and stood, and Joni touched her arm, not a hug, something more efficient, and Deb went through the doors. Joni turned. She looked at him the way she had looked at Cam in the parking lot. That same immediate, assessing attention. He was aware of his hands on his thighs. "When did they bring Trace in?" she said. He looked at her. "Cass told me it was March," she said. "Last year." He looked at the doors. "February," he said. "Admitted in February. March was—" He stopped. She crossed the room and sat down next to him. Not close enough to be a gesture, just present, adjacent in the next chair. "I was in Billings," she said. "When Trace went in, Cass called me, but I was 3 states out on a contract, and she looked at her hands. "I've thought about that a lot. There was nothing you could have done." "I know that," she was quiet, "doesn't help with the thinking." He looked at the television, the weather front on the map, the cold air moving down from Canada, which would arrive and do what weather does, make everyone slightly more honest about the limits of what they can withstand. "He said you'd be all right," Joni said. "Cass said that's what he kept saying, that you'd figure it out." "Figure what out?" She turned and looked at his profile. He turned and looked at her. Her face in the waiting room's fluorescent light. No softening in it, none of the social smoothing that most people apply, just her actual face, tired, attentive, doing what it did. "I don't know," she said. "He didn't specify," a pause. "I think he meant generally." He looked at her, she looked at him. The man across the chairs shifted and resettled. The television updated the front. Still coming, still cold, nothing they couldn't handle. "You should go back on," he said. "My shift ended 20 minutes ago." "Then you should go home." "I will." She didn't move. "You okay to drive?" He looked at his hands. They were steady now. "Yeah." "Okay." She stood up. He stood up. They stood there in the waiting room for a moment with the fluorescent light and the weather front and the ordinary medical smell of the place. "The favor," she said, "from the tire." He waited. "Come for dinner," she said. "Wednesday, bring Miller." He looked at her. "That's the favor," she said. "Okay." "Okay," he said. She nodded once and went back through the doors. He stood there a moment. Then he went out into the March night, which was cold and clear, the stars doing something dramatic that nobody was there to mention, the parking lot wet and reflective, the world going about its weather. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. Then he started it and drove home. On a Saturday in April, the first warm Saturday that meant it, he cleaned out the equipment barn. Methodical work, the kind that doesn't require thought. Sorting, moving, discarding the finished. Miller moved through the new grass slowly, an old dog rediscovering a catalog of smells. When he got to the Craftsman, he stopped. He had looked at it all winter from the barn door, closed the barn door on it, let it sit in the dark accumulating the cold. He pulled it out into the April light, all 3 drawers locked with rust, the red gone brown at the corners. He got the WD-40 and worked the lock until it gave. Worked the drawer slides until the top drawer moved, then the middle, then the bottom. A socket set, baling wire, the sediment of 2 men who fixed what broke. In the back of the middle drawer, a receipt. O'Reilly Auto Parts, Midland, 2011. Brake pads for a truck that no longer existed. He folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He reorganized the drawers, graduated the sockets the way he kept his own, wire brushed the rust from the corners until the red showed through in patches, rolled the box across the drive and into the equipment shed, sheltered, accessible in the light. He left the drawers open to air. He went inside and washed his hands at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at Trace's truck in the drive, the tires soft, the registration 8 months expired. He would deal with the truck. He knew what dealing with it would mean, and he had gotten to a place where he could mean it. Miller came through from outside and stood beside him at the sink. At 4:30, he heard tires on the gravel. He did not turn from the window. He listened to her car door, her footsteps on the porch boards, which he had learned by now their weight, their pace, the slight hesitation at the second board that was loose and that he kept meaning to fix. The screen door, its particular slam, the upper hinge needing attention, the specific percussion of this house receiving a person. She came into the kitchen, with Miller going to her immediately. "Good day," he said. "Long," she said. She went to the cabinet and got 2 glasses and filled them at the tap and set one near him, and took hers to the table and sat down. Miller settled at her feet. Outside the window, the April light was doing something new to the fields, warming them from below, the green coming up through the gray-brown, the earth becoming what it had always been going to be. She looked out at it. He stayed at the sink with his water glass and looked at the toolbox in the open shed, the 3 drawers open, the red showing through where the rust had been, the April light moving across it.